So hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Owusu. I'm an organization development practitioner and innovation specialist based in Johannesburg, South Africa. I move a little bit between countries. I also work out of Mozambique, and I'm co-founder of a boutique innovation consulting firm called Inkdot. And our purpose is really about making innovation practical, possible, tangible for organizations and helping them build their innovation capability from the inside out. I often say that I'm from the future, so I'm really honored to be having this conversation with this group of really, really awesome pioneers from across the globe about what might be possible for the future of organizations, and how thinking together about how we might truly unleash innovation and imagination potential across the world. I'm going to introduce my panel, and then I'm going to hand over to hear some introductions from each of them before we get into our conversation. But I hope you enjoy our conversation today. So with me today, I have Judith Okonkwo, who is a self-proclaimed technology evangelist. You can ask her questions about what that might mean. And she's the founder of Emisi 3D, that's pioneering augmented and virtual reality across the African continent. And she has a previous career in organization development. So I've known her some time. She's a sister from a while back. She's also a storyteller, and alongside me gathers stories of African everyday leadership through the We Will Lead Africa platform. I have Kerry-Jo Ford Lyn with me, who has a long-standing career as a development specialist. She's focused on innovative program design, and as part of Australia Foundation's leadership team, she's been responsible for managing the first ever federal grant supporting LGBTI communities and providing $3.5 million in grants to activists in 12 countries. And finally, I have Laxmi Parthasarathy with me, who is Chief Operating Officer at Global Press, which is redefining journalism by training and employing journalists for ethical news coverage. And she's a thought leader and communication specialist, especially in the development space. I don't want to say any more about them because I want to give them a chance to introduce themselves. I'm going to start with you, Judith. Please just give us a bit of a taster of who you are, what you're up to, and maybe a little bit about what innovation might mean for you.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all to discuss this issue. As Sarah has said, I'm a self-proclaimed technology evangelist. I'm also a business psychologist, but I tend to wear that technology evangelist hat the most these days because that's my current focus here on the African continent. I'm especially passionate about getting people to understand and start to adapt and adopt the extended reality technologies for use in all sorts of scenarios. And, you know, if you're curious, the extended reality technologies is an umbrella term that refers to things like augmented reality, virtual reality, and mixed reality. And, you know, Sarah says she's from the future. I grew up as a child dreaming of the future constantly. I often tell people that I was so sure when I grew up I'd be able to go to the moon on vacation. So I'm still waiting for things like that to catch up with my dreams. But I am, I wouldn't call it obsessed, but, you know, pretty focused on helping people to understand that everything we do today, if we're intentional, we're creating the future, and that we can kind of like go about that with a certain purpose. And alongside that purpose that we have, we will have the tools. And for me, a lot of these tools are technology to facilitate that and start to create what we want. So for me, what is innovation? You know, I think innovation is a mix of many things. I think it's a mix of, you know, of curiosity. It's a mix of saying, well, you know, why not? You know, I mean, you know, the sun, you know, rises in the east. Well, why in the world can't it rise from the west? It's all of those things that you're always wondering and questioning and experimenting with. It's finding new ways. It's thinking all sorts of kind of like new ideas. It's challenging the status quo. And it is the very thing that has allowed us to exist as the human race all of these years. So I think it is this critical, fundamental element that has been brought to the fore, particularly during this pandemic. And it's something that I think should be, I suppose, woven into just about every element of what we do. I was looking at some thoughts on innovation before this panel, and one struck out that has been ascribed to Einstein, which says, the thinking, something along the lines of the thinking that created the problems we have is certainly not the thinking that's going to create the solutions. And I think for that reason, and I think, if we just kind of like look at the world around us today, there is a great need for innovation and for new thinking and new ways.
Thanks, Judith. I really love the way that you talk about innovation as something that's just a deeply kind of inherent human thing that we do. And perhaps, what's got us here, both with the good and the bad, right? It's what's created so much of what we see around us, and maybe also what gets us into trouble sometimes. But we can dig into that a bit further as we move on in the conversation. Laxmi, please tell us who you are. Tell us a bit about how you relate to innovation.
Sure, Sarah, thank you so much. First and foremost, for getting my name correct. I know it's always a challenge. And Judith, I just have to say, I love that last quote. So powerful. And I've been thinking a lot about this when it comes to innovation. And I would love to share more about that. But first, I am Chief Operating Officer of Global Press, which is an international news organization. And as you mentioned, Sarah, we train and employ local female reporters in undercovered media markets to produce exceptional journalism. We actually operate over 40 independent news bureaus, from Kirumba in the Democratic Republic of Congo all the way to Arkhangai Province, Mongolia. And so this organization's been around for 15 years, was founded by Christy Hegrins, a social entrepreneur, to offer a counterpoint to the disaster-driven narrative that the 24-hour news cycle often prioritizes in international coverage. So, think topics of war, disaster, disease, poverty. As we all know, those are not the narratives that truly define a place, and we really have to produce comprehensive coverage of complex topics that really offers dignity and precision, first and foremost, to the communities that we're covering. So, when I'm thinking about innovation, it's actually, I think about the traditional definition about taking something to market. And when I'm thinking about journalism and international journalism in particular, I think actually a lot about old systems, old ways of thinking, and that solutions aren't yet imagined. So that's why I think, Judith, this quote that you mentioned is so powerful, especially when it comes to the journalism industry, right? I just talked about this disaster-driven framework that in the 24-hour news cycle. At Global Press, we do traditional journalism from the standpoint of the industry. However, we are reimagining what international journalism can and should be for both local and global audiences. We're doing that in ways of thinking about our approach in terms of the systems changes that we're creating. Great journalism can't happen without great journalism jobs. So really thinking about barriers of entry for females in particular to enter the industry in the markets that we cover. How do we lower those barriers? That's something we always take a look at in the countries that we enter. We're always looking at what does it mean to provide high quality employment opportunities, long-term employment opportunities for professional development for reporters, when so many people rely on the old mentality of kind of the freelancer network. That brings into question all sorts of other challenges that reporters have around duty of care, safety and security of local reporters. If we want to talk about innovation, there's just a lot of things that the industry is not prioritizing that then leads to broken systems that then leads to some of these challenges. And it really requires us to think about a system that can exist, though it may be challenging to create a system that prioritizes quality employment. These are the kind of innovative ways we need to be thinking and doing, even in old systems, if you will. So, I am really excited actually about talking about quality when it comes to building new systems, and not just quantity. We often talk about scale very quickly. How many news bureaus do you have? How many reporters do you have? That's actually, second, third order for us. It's much more about what is the quality of journalism that we are creating? How are we shifting narratives in the about the people and places that we are covering? And that just brings me to my final thought about Global Press News Services. This is a division of Global Press where we are able to offer some of the really phenomenal products and services that we leverage inside of the organization every day. And it's really been the secret sauce, the tools that we use every day in order to employ one of the most diverse global teams in journalism today. So I would love to talk more about what other organizations can do, and how we can help them to leverage some of the tools that we have in our organization.
This is obviously the greatest conversation to have ever happened, because I think, particularly around innovation, because I think a lot of people, when they see innovation in the title of something, what they're expecting is for it to be a conversation about tech, something shinier, something bigger, better. You talked about scale, Laxmi. Something that's about more growth, more, right? And I think what might be a common theme here for a lot of us is that we're trying to think about innovation as something that really fundamentally reimagines what's possible for us as humanity, and ways in which we might create a world that is full of beautiful things, full of quality things, full of dignity, full of justice, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that that's challenging our audience to think slightly differently about innovation, and maybe flipping on its head some of the myths that people might have in their minds about innovation. Kerry-Jo, over to you. Tell us who you are. Tell us what you think about innovation.
Thanks, Sarah. It's so lovely to come on the heels of Judith and Laxmi, because everything that you've been saying has resonated so much, especially Laxmi talking about who do you give the mic to, whose stories do you listen to, who gets to speak, and how do we value that information. And I reflect on one of my very first kind of community development projects in an extremely violent and volatile community in Jamaica. And they were completely fatigued from, foundations coming in and doing work, agencies, government agencies, the US government. And by the time I got there, I asked a few of the community members, what do you feel you need? And they said, we are tired. We are tired of being being the brunt of intervention, and we never get what we want. And so if you ask me what we need, I'm going to tell you, we need sports. We need a way to engage the youth. We need a way to talk about what's happening with our women. Domestic violence is a huge issue. And I listened. And a part of it is I listened because I was very young and I didn't have a clue how to do work with that type of community. And I listened because what they said resonated so deeply, because they understood what their needs were. And it went in the face of what traditional philanthropy or foundation practice was, and 20 years ago, to prioritize the needs of the people who you are serving and supporting. And I ended up co-creating a program around their needs. And we changed the face of that community together in such fundamental ways. The overall project was community policing. It failed dismally because the police were not engaged, but the community came together, and so many young people out of that project went on to do amazing, phenomenal things. And so for me, it was about a very fundamental lesson of listening. And that is something that is now coming back around to be standard practice in a lot of foundations. It's starting from the point of the priorities of the communities you serve. And on the face of it, when you hear it, when you read the articles, it's innovative. Actually, innovation starts at the community level. It starts at the indigenous level. And, it starts out of necessity. When you have nothing, you innovate. And that's a part of, something that I and many of my, Jamaican community understand intimately. When you have nothing, you create something. And that has served me well in every job that I've moved on to do. When I was chief operations officer at Digicel Foundation in Jamaica, that was what enabled me to think through connecting disparate dots and creating a social enterprise portfolio, which started with a conversation with a colleague at the university and saying, well, what if we blend academic research and what is happening there with the farmers, with schools who need to find different ways of engaging their students, of engaging the farming community and creating greenhouses where students can then learn about how to apply technology to agriculture, and then also using that produce in school feeding programs, and then selling the surplus and offsetting the overhead of schools. So it was about having conversations and connecting dots. That's for me what innovation has looked like. It's about connecting, ideas that seem so far apart, people who seem so far apart, and finding a way to create common ground and new ways of thinking around that. So now in the work that I do at Estrella, where I work with LGBTI activists all over, you know, Estrella has been doing this kind of feminist funding for over 40 years, where they have been prioritizing the needs and priorities of the activists on the ground by giving them core support. That is also something that, you hear as completely innovative to major foundations now. Wow, let's just give them core support. Let's not tie it to, 15% overhead and, 85% going to a project. Why don't we just give them the money because they need it? And what's happened in, the last year where COVID, a global pandemic has occurred, we realize that we need to get resources to the communities as fast as possible, with as much flexibility as possible. And we've been able to shift the narrative at USAID to say, well, we're giving them the money, and we're giving them without these conditions because that's what they need. And it in emergency response, but it's not just in emergencies. In many countries, in many communities, it's an emergency every day. And so we're thinking about ways in which we're shifting narratives at every level. And, also thinking about what you said, Lakshmi, when you think about scale, when you think about quantity versus quality, you know, 10 years ago, if you were to ask, what is the impact of your work? People would give you numbers. And now, the conversation is shifting to what are the stories that you can tell me of impact that you're making in communities? We've always known this, especially as women. We've always known that impact is in the stories. Impact is in the human stories that we tell every day, and it's not about numbers. And so, innovation is something we are used to doing every single day. And as you said, Sarah, it's not some major tech revival. It's not, it's everyday kind of shifting new ways of looking at things that are possibly just old ways, and bringing those conversations in and listening to more people who typically have never had the mic.
I love this so much. I love that we're getting onto storytelling, and I want to stay with that a little bit. So if it's not the case that innovation is something that happens over in Silicon Valley, but indeed it's something that everyday people, let's call it that, know intimately, and particularly within constraints and out of necessity, people know how to innovate. How did we get here? I'm going to throw this question at Laxmi. How did we get here where we have this narrative that that's what innovation is, and what might we imagine that could be different?
Yeah, so thanks for the really easy question, Sarah. No, I think it has a lot to do with being comfortable. Sometimes, we see what we see, what's right in front of us, what's accessible, and I think back to, the first time I really started something of my own, created something from scratch. There were so many naysayers about what I was trying to build and create, and people that were ready to define me and my story as a cute, nice, charitable idea that you have. And if I had allowed people to define that as a cute, nice, charitable idea, I never would have launched this newspaper to go on for 10 years. So when I think about, what is it about these definitions? We define ourselves. We allow people to define what new and shiny means, what innovation means. And I think we also get comfortable with those narratives of, whether it's as you mentioned, Silicon Valley and other tech hubs of what new actually means, right? I mentioned it earlier, when you take it to market. But at the same time, I think, especially when we're talking about storytelling and when we're talking about creating narratives, and in journalism in particular, this moment that we're in, really, I challenge so many news organizations to take this moment to really think about new ways of doing things, and actually not the old way of doing things in the new industry. So not necessarily, I think, as Kerry-Jo, you were mentioning just this idea of kind of going back to old ways of doing things. I think in the journalism industry in particular, I would say that we have so long relegated diverse voices, and that has been temporarily paused. Every model of international journalism that we know requires someone who knows very little about a place to helicopter into another place to tell stories about that community. And if they were just to hand over the pen to the person who their source is, they would much likely get a much better story. And so, I think if we don't take this moment to recognize that foreign correspondence as an industry has almost come to a standstill in a moment where everywhere we were grounded all over the world. And really, we saw a huge reliance on local reporters, on the local voices, on local communities to tell these really critical stories about health and consequences of coronavirus and how to access support. And these were critical, potentially life-altering access to information that local reporters were able to provide. Now, if we were to go back to the old models, those local reporters would be your fixer, your researcher, everything other than the person that gets the byline. And so, I really challenge us in this moment to think about not returning to that old way of doing things. I've been thinking a lot about what's been happening in Uganda over the last 5 days. In a world we live in where an entire internet shutdown can happen when people need access to information during such a critical period. How do we innovate in systems that can be highly disruptive, that can be problematic when it comes to human rights. You know, that when we think about coronavirus and how that's been so challenging for people to navigate high quality access to information, but then how that's also been leveraged by so many governments around the world to stifle voices, innovating within a system where an internet can be shut down in a country prior to an election, requires us to think about safety and security, alternative communication tools, mesh networks. You know, so there are a lot of ways that we need to be thinking about technology, perhaps as a support or a supplement to these new ideas, but not the idea in itself.
Yeah, we could go down a deep rabbit hole, I think, there about misinformation, information warfare, and how technology is getting us into all kinds of traps. At the start of the pandemic, at least as it started to unfold here in Mozambique, where I was at the time, there were two kind of existential crisis moments for me. One was like standing in a supermarket about to panic shop, and eventually I didn't. But the other was this part that you're describing now of just a really deep desire to not go back the way it was, starting with myself, right? And thinking about how do I hold myself accountable for reimagining what's possible after this, if there is an after or during, or, you know, as things unfold. But really taking this moment as and the possibility spaces that are opening up despite all of the challenges, and really taking that seriously. So I want to go back to you, Judith. So at the start, you said these words about how we can be more intentional. So how does that relate? How does being intentional relate to innovation? And maybe also a little bit about what you're seeing. What are you seeing emerge on the ground in the work that you're doing? What's emerging from the various countries that you have oversight of?
So perhaps I'll start with what I'm seeing emerge in my space. And, you know, as we all know, once the pandemic started and we all became much more stationary beings wherever we were located, all of a sudden, you know, there was this emphasis on online, on virtual. We were just, you know, laughing about, you know, one more Zoom meeting or panel happening. And with the work that I do, looking at kind of like multiple realities and how you can engage in those virtual spaces, you know, I think that was naturally one aspect of technology that people looked at and said, hey, is this something that we can leverage, you know? And in different institutions around the world, you know, people were saying, okay, we still want to connect with people beyond the ways we can using a tool like video conferencing. So let's try virtual reality. And, you know, I mean, in lots of different institutions, the World Bank, for example, their high level meetings, they're doing VR because they want to get everybody in the same room together, you know, even if it's just your avatars at this stage. But one thing that definitely highlighted is the disparity, you know, that we all know exists between the countries where you can have access to these technologies and you have the infrastructure to support it, and the spaces where that's not available. One of the areas in which I'm especially passionate when it comes to these extended reality technologies in African cities is the potential it has for transforming, you know, the grand challenges I would say we have with education on the continent. And often when I'm explaining this to people, I'll say, you know, if you go into a city like Lagos, we all know it's a mega city, and the population is large. I think that would be an understatement. But you go into a public school and a typical classroom can easily have 70 or 80 students on average. And you'll have that number, you'll just have a teacher, you know, one teacher, basic infrastructure. So chairs, tables, a black or whiteboard. And 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 you might not have kind of like the other complementary things that really kind of like enhance the quality of education that you're passing on to your young people. So there might not be like labs for the sciences, certainly no no budget for things like field trips, that sort of thing. And for me, I then say, well, if you are able to kind of like go into you know a school like that, and you put in a VR lab, kind of like low cost and mid-range VR, you are then able to provide these experiences, these learning experiences for students that they would not have otherwise had. So they can do experiments in virtual labs, for example. They can, virtually kind of like explore the pyramids of Egypt or even visit the Eiffel Tower. But what that does is that, for a child who is in a public school in one of kind of like the outlying suburbs of Lagos, who would never have imagined what, the pyramids, look like, or even the scale of them. They could kind of like literally step inside it, right? The experiments that they couldn't do because, you're not going to quite going to have Bunsen burners and all of that because there's no lab. They would be doing virtually and kind of like, going through that experiential learning experience that then will translate to learning outcomes that, we're all aspiring to. And I think that kind of like, shift in thinking is fundamental. I loved how both Kerry-Jo and Laxmi, you highlighted how there has to be this move from the focus on quantity, on the numbers, to actual quality. And I think certainly if we looked at the initiatives globally around things like education, a couple of decades ago, it was always about increasing the numbers, right? So we want to have more children in school. We want to reduce the number of out-of-school children in the world. We want to do all of these things, but there wasn't quite the emphasis on learning outcomes. And so you have situations where, yes, there might be more children in school now, but they don't know a whole heck of a lot more, after that experience. And isn't that a huge problem? So I think when we think about, kind of like things like that and the potential that innovation has to affect that kind of grand challenge, we then look at kind of like the tools that need to be available to facilitate that, right? For people to kind of like say, hey, I'm thinking about a really, creative way to solve this problem, and I have all of this available to me to play with. Um, both Kerry-Jo and Lakshmi, you talked about kind of like the resource constrained approach that has driven a lot of innovation. And certainly, in a place like I am, we always say innovation is a way of life, because you just have to, like your child, you're building your toy, right? Um, you're definitely not going to have parents going off to Toys R Us to buy stuff for you, for the majority of the population. Obviously, it happens for some. But, that's just kind of like driving your everyday. And the way I think about it is, wouldn't it be great if whoever you are, whatever you wanted to build, kind of like you had more bits and pieces available to you so you could do this? Now, that lack, I think, is something that has caused like the great imbalance that I would say we have in the world. So going back to my kind of like earlier points about, the change that we saw with the pandemic and this kind of like reliance now on virtual means of communicating and engaging, what we would see on the ground is that while everywhere, folks are kind of like dealing with homeschooling children and virtual school and, planning VR for meetings and things like that, here it's like, oh, wait, is there going to be electricity? Is the internet going to hold up? How many systems, do we have to have the backup so that your conference call doesn't go down? And I think that that's kind of like the role that I see with technology, that as opposed to it being the innovation per se, it is kind of like the building blocks for it. It's the enabler. It's this thing that should exist, a tool that will allow people to then go ahead and create. And that lack shouldn't exist where some people have it and some people don't. Because then, I mean, I know in the UK, for example, they're thinking about, oh, what will this gap in schooling mean for the students? They've been homeschooled, they've not been able to go in and do their exams, the way they ordinarily would. GCSEs have been canceled, etc. But there are other parts of the world where quite literally, there isn't even that option of, homeschooling in that sense, or Zoom lessons. Now, of course, there are great innovations happening around that. So we're seeing people provide education solutions via things like radio, and all of that. But as with that, as with any technology, it will still be a question of access, right? Who has a radio? Who has internet? And I think these are the things that I suppose fundamentally I would want innovation to be solving. So you talked about kind of like, looking at that future lens and being intentional about the future. Um, and often when I'm talking about the future with people, I'm like, can you imagine what it was like when plastic was being invented, right? It was this amazing thing. They thought like, wow, look at what we can create that's so cheap and so versatile, and we can do all of this great stuff with. But then, voila, all of these unintended consequences that, can now kind of like, set us on the path for destruction. So that's kind of like where the intentionality comes in, knowing that for everything that we're doing today, we're creating the future that will come. And if we think about what that future, should be, what we would like it to be, then that will in some way temper what we do. Because for me, technology is neither good nor bad. It just is. It's all about what you do with it, and what you do with it is how you build it, how you create it, who shapes it, you know, and what you see it, going ahead to create for society.
Letting that land. um, so I heard a couple of things in there. One, kind of the reiterating what I've heard, I think you all say now, that maybe one of the principles of innovation is really deeply, truly understanding the problem, and probably more so knowing that the people who have the need or the problem are probably the experts on the solutions as well. I also heard in there that if we don't think really intentionally and deeply, and I guess expansively, about the types of innovations we want to bring about or the types of problems we want to try and solve, we might find ourselves in a trap where we define things too narrowly and end up creating a bunch of unintended consequences or externalities that that really don't serve us further down the line. I want to move to thinking a little bit about what might people do, and what, particularly what might organizations do, and I will start with you, Kerry-Jo, but I'd really love to hear all of your answers in this area of conversation. But if we think about, it's a tricky topic. How do we begin to imagine a different way forward? How do we begin to innovate? What might organizations do? Feel free to talk from your experience of what you're doing within your organizations, but also what you might be seeing on the ground, maybe through the organizations that you support, Kerry-Jo.
Such an important question, especially as we're all going through significant change. And I think one thing is to recognize that change is constantly happening. And it can happen in small ways or massive ways. It can happen for individuals within an organization, the organization itself, or the communities. And now we're seeing, the world experiencing something together through the pandemic. Well, everyone except New Zealand. But, and so one of the things that, to answer this question, I go back to your example, Sarah, about being in the supermarket. And I think that originally or initially, our first kind of, our instinct is to react to change. And what instead you did was you paused and you responded to whatever was happening instead. And there is a difference between being reactive and being responsive. And often for many communities, for many organizations, it's having resources, whether it's time, people, or money, in order to make the difference between being a reactive organization and being a responsive one. So an example of this is, you are doing a contract, something comes up, there's a breach, there's fraud, and you react to it. But being responsive is you react to it in the moment and address the thing that's time sensitive. But long term, you create a process, a plan, a mitigation strategy, so that in the future you can be strategic about your response. And I think that that's one of the things that we haven't necessarily named, which is being strategic in our response, being strategic in our innovation, being strategic about how we approach change, because change is always happening. It's whether or not you're managing it, whether you're resourced to manage it, and whether or not you're doing it with a particular lens. And that lens, when we talk about strategic planning, some people think, oh, yes, we have to create a 5-year strategic plan. That's sometimes no longer relevant anymore. The world is changing so quickly that a 3-month strategic plan is what you need. And that is a different way of thinking. And that in itself is bordering on innovation, yes, but it's also looking at a reinvention of your business model, a reinvention of the way that you do things. And we have all gone through a process of reinvention in the last year. Judith, you touched on it. In the pandemic, we mostly went virtual. And that means that we had to reinvent the ways that we collaborated. We had to reinvent the ways that we worked. We had to reinvent the ways that we thought about individual and collective care. What does it mean to take care of yourself in the middle of a pandemic while doing all the work that you needed to be done, taking care of the kids, taking care of the parents, taking care of everyone and yourself while managing that 24-hour disaster news cycle? So I think that it's really critical to think about reaction versus response, resources that you would need in order to move to a responsive space, and then also being strategic in that, managing that change, and then shifting the way that we think about strategic planning and preparing ourselves and our organizations. And I think one thing to mention too is there's necessarily going to be fear when we talk about change. There's necessarily going to be fear when we talk about innovation. There are some people who will initially be great, yes, let's do it. And other people who are just like, no, are you mad? Because it's familiar. Where you are is familiar, even if it's dysfunctional. And I think that the first step is to manage fear and acknowledge that fear is normal, natural, and then move into a strategic place. So I think, so the supermarket example is so perfect for a number of things. You had a fear response, you went into reactive mode, you resourced yourself, and then you responded strategically. So I think those are some of the great ways of doing it at a personal level and professionally and within organizations.
Thanks, Kerry-Jo. And I'm one of those people who's like, woo, let's go for the change. Let's go for the transformation, right? But even I obviously, have that tension and your point about what it looks like to take care of yourself and each other as we navigate all of this is also really relevant. I'm also sitting with this, there's a certain complexity in what you're saying about think strategically and deliberately, intentionally about what the impact might be long term, but also don't get caught up in that too much, because we have to be adaptive and have plans that might be short term. So I guess there's another point here about really building our capacity for nuance and complexity and polarities, and just holding that all those things can be true at the same time.
And can I say rest? Rest has to be in there somewhere. You have to plan for rest.
Yeah.
Yeah, on that point, if you don't mind me adding, you know, Kerry-Jo, this point about responsiveness, I can't underscore that enough. This idea, going back to this point that I made earlier about self-definition, organizational definition in times of crisis, change, good or bad, really requires that sense of self. What are we doing? Why are we doing this? A 5-year strategic plan is one thing, but really a focus on the mission. For Global Press during the pandemic, or I mean, this ongoing pandemic, it's not over. It's been this focus on, we train and employ local reporters to produce exceptional journalism through and through. That is our bread and butter. And regardless of what's happening around us, we have to understand that though the world is in chaos, we are not in chaos. We have our North Star, and we have to figure out how to be responsive to that chaos around us, not necessarily constantly reacting every time, a government changes their protocol on whether a reporter is an essential service or not. So that focus and intention on your definition and not allowing others to define you in that moment is critical. I also think about here, we touched on this briefly in terms of measurement. So when you're connecting strategy, at Global Press, we actually use the objective and key results system. I think this really allows us to bring in some quantitative measures with also the ability to shift and change our goals based on being responsive, not reactionary, and really thoughtful about what's happening around us. Measuring What Matters is a book I recommend for organizations that are trying to figure out, what can I do if I'm not creating a strategic plan that's 5 years long. Objectives and key results really helped us bring that focus to make sure that we're together across the organization, from reporters to Washington, D.C. staff to our Sri Lanka staff, making sure that everyone understands transparently what we're working toward, so that there's the opportunity to collaborate. And when collaboration happens is when innovation happens. When there's divisions, we often see a stifling of innovation. So, going back to measurements and being intentional, that we're not looking at how many news bureaus and how many reporters solely, that it's also about how many reporters have stayed with Global Press for over 5 years. I can confidently say 70% of Global Press Journal reporters stay with Global Press for over 5 years. That's an indicator that there's high quality employment. There's a reason for people to stay here. They feel valued. Safety and security is prioritized. Wellness is prioritized. And so I think, that's my final point, this idea, again, I think we've all touched on it. If we're reactionary for 365 days, we're all going to burn out. And in this moment, I really challenge individuals and organizations to think about wellness. We prioritize safety and security in 4 ways: physical, emotional, digital, and legal security of all of our staff around the world. And when we're thinking about being innovative in our industry, the story is often prioritized over the human being telling that story. And by putting an emphasis on duty of care, on wellness, and the holistic human being telling that story, I guarantee you we're going to end up with a more innovative product than any organization that's not prioritizing those things, because we're seeing the whole picture here and not just the story we're going after. And so, regardless of what organizations are trying to accomplish, what products they're trying to build, if there isn't a prioritization on wellness and response, I think even the most cool, flashy, incredible idea or technology or product will never come to full fruition. And that's been the way that Global Press focuses on things. And as I mentioned, Global Press News Services is an incredible opportunity for other organizations to leverage the principles that we use inside of our organizations to design and develop duty of care programs for their own organization, or how to prioritize diversity inside of their organization. And speaking of diversity, that is certainly something that leads to more innovation and more quality innovation within organizations. The more diversity of thought, the more diversity of experience, the more likely we are to develop diverse products. And I can go on about what some of those are, but I invite everyone to reach out to Global Press News Services, and I'd be happy to chat more about that.
Thanks, Laxmi. And I think what you're all really doing is it gets thrown around. The word human-centered gets thrown around a lot when we talk about innovation, but what you've done is really bring to life what that actually looks like in practice. Judith, I'm going to give you just a minute, half a minute of a final sentence about what can people do? What should organizations be doing?
Actually, a minute works well because my co-panelists have said it so well. And I just want to reiterate two of the points that they have made. So Kerry-Jo said, manage the fear, when she was referring to you in the supermarket. And a question that I like to think about a lot, and I like to challenge people to think about is, if everything that we know now is not true, what would it be? What would you start to create? I often remind people that once upon a time, the world was flat, and that was fact, and if you think about everything from that lens, then all of the things that we're holding on to, do we need to hold on to them? And I think if you can start to kind of like have that looseness, if you will, that ability to be kind of like really agile in your thinking, then it makes so much more possible. And then the second point that I want to reemphasize is one that Laxmi brought up, which I think is so critical, is that at the end of the day, it is all about people. It is all about us, Everything that we're searching for is within the human. And if we can focus on humanity in all of the ways possible, and that's kind of like embracing difference. It's saying that in organizations, for example, if I focus on making sure that my people are the center of my organization, and we all know that there's psychological studies that show that in that case, you then have much more kind of like productive and happy and fulfilled colleagues. If that is the case, then they will certainly innovate and find, kind of like solutions or drive your organization to where you need it to be. So how do we then really, truly focus on people? And I think that there certainly needs to be a new way of looking at this, because if we think about kind of like the narrative around big tech, let's say a decade ago, it was all about these organizations that you go into and there were great meals and great cafeterias, and you might have like a Michelin star chef popping in to do some great food, and you'd have all of these perks and all of that. But we're seeing that, it's like there has to be this true alignment, in terms of the ethos of the organization and what it's espousing for its people. Because those things still exist in those organizations, but we've all seen the other scandals that have come up alongside them, where there's like the suppression of the colleague voice, where there are all of these other issues. So can we find a way to truly fundamentally be about our people? And then if we can do that, I believe that, it's innovation unleashed.
Thank you so much. Humanity first is what I'm hearing loud and clear, and it needs to be more than just skin deep. The call to action, I think, to the audience is that these are your words, Judith. We are creating the future that will come right now. So let's be intentional about that. Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Kerry-Jo. Thank you, Laxmi, for being who you are and for everything that you do.